Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for accepting our video interview request. And I'm very happy to see you in our program. You were very critical of the Karabakh war throughout the 44-day hostilities between late September and early November. I absolutely agree. A war is terrible and brings destruction. But many people in Azerbaijan would disagree by pointing out to the 25-plus-year negotiations, which had produced almost nothing and were accepted by the Azerbaijani society simply as a means for Armenia and even for the Minsk Group co-chairs to protect the status quo. As a result of the resultless talks, war was finally left as a last resort. What is your take on that?
Yeah, well, Rusif, thank you very much for inviting me. And you're right. I mean, I was concerned in July that there would be a war, and I spoke out about it, not to take the side of anyone, but you know, we've had goodness, I don't know what the casualty figures are. I saw recently that the Armenian Ministry of Health said that 3,300 Armenians died. I know the Azerbaijani Ministry of Defense had a similar number in that range. And you know, my whole concern, you know, before and during the war was the human cost. And I took, fortunately, I don't have to make decisions as far as U.S. government policy is. I'm no longer ambassador. There was a lot of criticism from both Armenians and Azerbaijanis, quite frankly, for the position that I took. But that was the reason for it. And you know, the war, the ceasefire is in place. That's all to the good because except for what are continuing ceasefire violations, which have taken place since November 10, the war hasn't started again. And that to me would be the tragedy. What I think is the real tragedy here is that the situation that we're in today, we could have been in, when the Madrid principles were announced over a decade or more ago now, because it was, return of the occupied territories, and then discussion of between Armenians and Azerbaijanis about Nagorno-Karabakh itself. Where I take exception, and you laid out very clearly what the criticism was of the Minsk Group process and the fact that this was a frozen conflict, quite frankly, from 1994 to the present, or to November or September, whenever the war actually started. And quite honestly, it's become a frozen conflict again. But had both Armenia and Azerbaijan been prepared to accept the Madrid formulation as the starting point for negotiations, this war would have been unnecessary. Now, was it the fault of the Minsk Group process? I mean, that's the criticism, particularly of the co-chairs, particularly of France and the United States. And here's where you tell me if there's a word for mediator in the Azerbaijani language. Because when I see people talk about mediation, the idea from Azerbaijanis, and I think to a certain extent Armenians, was that the mediator's job is to come in and impose their, that is, Yerevan or Baku's position on the other party. That's what mediators do. I'm a professional diplomat, retired now, but mediation is outside powers who facilitate contacts between the parties to a conflict. And that's where the failure took place, that there were no ongoing, extensive, I will say this critically of both Armenia and Azerbaijan, serious diplomatic discussions. There would be meetings either with the Minsk Group co-chairs, or they'd go off to someplace in France, Russia, or the United States. And the heads of state and government would talk to each other across the table for a period of time, but not negotiate. And that to me, you know, you can blame the process, fine, but I think the ultimate responsibility has to be in Yerevan and Baku to engage in serious, direct, meaningful discussions that lead at some point to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. There are only two parties to this. It's only Armenia and Azerbaijan. Don't talk to me about, you know, whatever you want to call Stepanakert and all. I mean, the parties to the dispute, Armenia and Azerbaijan. And let me just fast forward with a comment. From what I can tell from the meetings that just took place in Moscow, we're beginning to see signs of a you know, elements of a process where there are going to be direct face-to-face discussions. I'd prefer them without the Russians around. They really don't have to be around, but to address some concrete aspects of building peace in the South Caucasus. I saw in the media reports that security officials from Armenia and Azerbaijan got together. I think it was even in Armenia. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but this is the kind of thing that I would have hoped could have taken place without a war. The war happened. We're dealing with a new reality, but it's got to be, you know, we got to take it beyond this ceasefire and start building what I would call a framework of engagement, multifaceted, multi-speed, direct contacts between Armenia and Azerbaijan authorities and people to build a peace. Sorry, that's a longer answer than you wanted.
No. Thank you very much for your thought. But before jumping into a conversation about Russia and the new geopolitical realities in the region, right. Comment on what you just said about the Minsk Group. Yes, it is officially a body for mediation, and the three co-chairing countries are like mediators. I do agree with you, but at the same time, I'll try to deliver to you the sentiments, the trends which are circulating among the Azerbaijani society, which had been very disillusioned about the attitude, especially of the Western powers, to the conflict, and what our society considers an unfair position, which does not distinguish between the occupant and the victim, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is what most Azerbaijanis are complaining about. Do you have anything to say?
So I understand that. I understand that view. After I left Baku, I was ambassador in Sarajevo.
Yes.
In Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the immediate aftermath of the war there. And there was this constant tension between who was the victim, who was the aggressor, why aren't you taking the side of the victim over the aggressor? So I understand how, from an Azerbaijan point of view, and from the point of view of individual Azerbaijanis, you would criticize.
For interrupting you, but you lived in Azerbaijan in the mid-90s, and you yourself, I witnessed the miserable situation of hundreds of thousands of IDPs. Their situation became a bit better throughout the years, but especially in the mid-90s, that was terrible. That was a disaster.
Well, and that,
remember that?
And I will tell you, as you know, the first trip as the U.S. ambassador in Baku that my wife and I made together was to the front in 1994 before the ceasefire then. And we saw firsthand, you know, people living out in the open under trees, and you know, I spent 3 years with the handicap of Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act that prevented me from doing anything more than providing assistance to the refugees and IDPs. You know, that tragedy of 907, I think was a real problem for U.S.-Azerbaijan relations in that period you just mentioned. It you know, it bothered me not only to, you know, to see people living after the ceasefire came into being in rail cars, in tents, and then coming to Baku. Some of these refugees were put in living conditions that were unbelievable for me to go into these apartment buildings with no running water, with no bathroom facilities, and kids and you know, grandmas and everybody kind of thrown into conditions. So you know, I understand that, you know, it's the sort of tragedy that's connected with a war like this, that really, you know, part of this peace process has to be coming to grips with what do we do for those people who are forced to leave, and what do they do? And I will tell you, it's not as easy as it would appear. Again, I go back to the Bosnian experience. Same issue. People were driven out of their homes because of the war, and the war is over. And that was only 5 years, right? We're talking about a conflict, as you pointed out. You know, some of these people have been, you know, 28 years, 30 years. It's no longer the people who were expelled, but their children and their grandchildren. And you know, I'm raising this as just a very, very practical issue. Someone has to find out how many people want to go back to their homes. The assumption is, and I wish that were the case in Bosnia, that people would feel comfortable enough to want to go back to their homes and try to build a new life. I'm not saying you can't reset the clock, right?
Exactly.
So how do you create conditions for that to happen for as many people as want to go back? And in Bosnia, that was a massive process. It took 50,000 peacemakers at the very beginning to be able to provide security so that people could begin to make those kinds of decisions. But what I found out during my 2 years there was the people who went back were the old folks. The younger people, you know, had jobs or developed, you know, connections with the community where they were now living, and didn't want to give those up. And so the return question has to be, you know, has to have at least two parts. One, do everything you can to provide a security situation so people can return. Get rid of the landmines and unexploded ordnance. Make sure there's going to be no return to war, right? And if there are people who don't want to return, you have to find out some way of compensating them. And I know Azerbaijanis don't want to talk about this, but there are Armenians also who must be able to take advantage of that. I'm not talking about, you know, the people who were brought in from outside the region and settled in some of the occupied territories, Lachin and others. I'm talking about people, Armenians who have lived in that place we call Nagorno-Karabakh perhaps for as long as their Azerbaijani neighbors had lived there. And that, I can just tell you from the Bosnian experience, that was horrible. When you brought people back into minority situations, Serbs, I saw this in particular, Serb refugees being brought back to live in areas where Croats and Bosniaks were the majority. And I visited those communities, and very brave people. But again, there has to be some mechanism in place that allows that to happen, and it really has to start with the security environment. And if there's I think there are a lot of weaknesses to the November 10th statement. It is not an agreement. You know, I always do time out when somebody starts talking about an agreement. This is not an agreement. It's very carefully worded. Even Putin, yesterday in the one statement that I saw attributed to him, talked about the statement. And as a diplomat, that's a very, very important distinction to make. You need agreements now. Maybe what, you know, the deputy economic ministers who are now, or I can't remember now which category it is, are going to agreed to meet to talk about transportation and economic links. That's an agreement. So you've got the two parties actually signing signing a document, and that's I think the direction that things really have to go. But you know, this return of people to their homes, that is such a big problem, and it's not going to be easy.
Exactly, Mr. Ambassador. The return of IDPs to their homes has been discussed very proactively in the Azerbaijani society. And unlike Bosnia, in our case, you may have seen the pictures and video footages. Almost the entire pre-war infrastructure has been destructed,
Right.
in the adjacent districts, not Nagorno-Karabakh itself. Therefore,
No,
exactly. Rebuilding everything, settlements, infrastructure, starting everything from zero would require years and billions of dollars. And you rightfully pointed out demining, because
yes.
Every day someone, both servicemen and civilians, are dying because of mines. It's a big minefield.
Well, you know, again, we're talking the Bosnian War went on for 5 years,
right?
And you know, it wasn't just mines that the two armies laid, but you know, artillery shells that didn't go off, you know, unexploded ordnance, and this is what was killing people, and I think still continues to do so. This is not going to go away, and you know, I'm happy when I see pictures of Azerbaijani soldiers, of Turkish soldiers, even Russians, I think, involved in demining. But that's not enough if you're talking about civilians returning to a normal life. I mean, it is labor intensive. It requires, you know, human and material resources. And that, you know, again, back to the statement in November 10, that kind of detail, you know, has to be developed and fleshed out. And who's going to do this? Are you going to involve the international community? Do you have joint, you know, efforts between Azerbaijanis and Armenians in those areas where both sides know that, you know, that there were mines? I mean, I remember one time that I went to the 96 or 97 when I went to the front then. And we went up to the trench area and walked right through a minefield. I mean, it was scary. And that was, you know, as you say, I mean, this was, you know, what's gone on, not only, you know, during the 44-day war, but in the run-up to it is really going to be a big problem, and absolutely have to do a very intensive, comprehensive job of removing these these devices if people are going to be able to safely return home. I mean, it would be the worst outcome is to have people who've waited as long as some of them have to go back home, and then they or members of their family are killed because of these things. That's why I don't like war, by the way. You know, it's
Mr. Ambassador, as a result of the fading attention of the United States and the European Union to the conflict, two nations, Russia and Turkey, emerged as the key actors by effectively sidelining the Minsk group. How would you assess the new geopolitical realities on the ground?
Yeah. Well, here again, I may take a different position on this. You know, from the day well, actually before that, because I'd been working on the conflict when I was in Washington before I became ambassador. But it was clear the only two outside actors who really were in a position to influence developments on the ground were Russia and Turkey. You know, at that time, I mean, Elchibey was as pro-Turk as you can imagine. The Russians, obviously, mainly for bad reasons, were very influential. So I'm not sure that, you know, that constellation of forces is really any different today. You know, Russia and Turkey were the most important, and they continue to be so in the future. You know, I will agree with you. I'm very critical of the Trump administration's foreign policy generally, because it involves pulling the U.S. back, not just in the South Caucasus, but globally. And I think that was a mistake. I think, you know, from the very beginning, where they did not give the ambassadorial title to Andrew, our Minsk group negotiator, was a mistake. But it was kind of indicating that we weren't going to get involved. U.S. attention was elsewhere, including Iran. We haven't talked about Iran yet. And you know, the U.S.-Russia relationship was complicated, to say the least. So, you know, we dealt, you know, when the war broke out in November. Sorry, I keep saying November. It's when when the ceasefire went into effect. But you know, when the war broke out, we weren't playing. I mean, we were not involved. There was no Secretary of State visit to the region to try to, you know, lead a Minsk group effort to, you know, to bring about a ceasefire or, you know, more actively become involved. So I agree on that part. I think Turkey and Russia, while they both, you know, as I believe, been the major actors, I think their roles have changed over the years. During the Haydar Aliyev period, Azerbaijani-Russian relations were not good. During Ilham Aliyev's period, they're much better. The Turks are, I'm not sure how to describe it. I mean, they were influential during the time I was there. They were also involved in attempting a coup against Haydar Aliyev, you know, quite frankly. But you know, their relationship with Ilham Aliyev has been complicated. Energy has been the major glue there, and I think Erdogan certainly post his own you know, problems with Gulenist, has looked on the relationship with Baku largely through the lens of cooperating with Azerbaijan against Gulenist forces outside. The military relation has expanded, but even during my time there, the Turks were directly involved in training the Azerbaijani military. But the Turkish involvement on that side is increased. You know, Russia is more involved with both Armenia and Azerbaijan on the military side. sell a lot of Russian military equipment to Azerbaijan, and evidently not as much to Armenia. You know, they're playing an important role. They've always played a role. It's a different role. But bottom line in all this, neither Russia nor Turkey, alone or individually, can provide the framework for building a lasting peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I'm not questioning, this is not questioning motivation, just questioning objectively the capabilities to do that. And I think that the Russians are going to find out, if they haven't already, that, you know, 2,000 troops or however many they've got in this peacekeeping operation aren't going to be enough. What do you do then? The Armenians won't accept Turkish troops, you know, in their area of interest, or certainly in Armenia. And what I think is going to happen, so here's my, you know, based on just no evidence whatsoever, there's going to be something like a Dayton process that took hold in Bosnia, where Europe and the US, you know, after the destructive wars that went on for over a decade, the former Yugoslavia, and then that period in Bosnia and Herzegovina itself, found out that it needed a collective international community engagement to build the peace process, and to have it kind of multi-layered, and pieces running at different time schedules, involve the UN, involve non-government organizations, involve civil society. And you know, we just had the 25th anniversary of Dayton, and nobody's going to, who's been involved in that at all, is going to stand up and say, this is the perfect example. It is far from it. And a lot of the problems, and this is a lesson for you all, in Bosnia and Herzegovina after 25 years, are still to be addressed. But it did provide a mechanism that allowed the parties to the war to get together and start working on problems, however serious they were, but on practical problems to build a peace. And that's what somehow, that's what has to happen between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I would broaden this. I mean, I think I saw a reference to an article today. I think it was Trend, and I apologize. I can't remember who made the point, but something about a stability pact for the South Caucasus. I was part of the Stability Pact in 1999. We had this huge meeting. Clinton and European heads of state came to Bosnia and brought together people in the region, recognizing Milosevic was still a problem at that time, but recognizing that the only way you were going to build peace was not even throwing all the resources into a particular country, but bringing the neighbors involved in recognizing cooperation was critical. And here, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, you know, this is what, you know, we need to ensure stability, you know, among those three countries, and to try to create conditions that are broader than just the immediate conflict, as important as it is between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Mr. Ambassador, as we are recording this interview, the United States is preparing for transition of power. The team President-elect Joe Biden has selected is already known, and some forecasts can be made, I believe. After years of US disengagement from the South Caucasus, what can we predict about the American role in the region and on the conflict? Activization or continuation of the same policy?
Well, you know, everybody likes to speculate on that, and you'll find all kinds of talking heads like me who think they know what the new administration is going to do and what their priorities are, and really don't know. Let me just make 2 points. One, the nominations that have been made so far, and again, these are at relatively senior levels in our national security and in our foreign policy structures, have tended to be people who had experience during the Obama administration in some fashion or another. And so Secretary of State Tony Blinken, was very, very involved during the Obama administration across the whole range of foreign policy issues. The new Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, one of the architects of the Iranian agreement. Toria Nuland, who's going to be the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, kind of the, if you will, the most senior position within the State Department, has extensive experience with Russia, Ukraine, including this part of the world. We have a new director of Central Intelligence, Bill Burns, who comes out of the State Department environment with a lot of Russia and Middle East background. So you have a lot of people, known quantities, let me put it that way, who are going to be taking up positions. What we do not know, and that's not going to be visible until we get well into 2021, is how this background is going to be integrated into the problems that President Biden will face as the new president of the United States. And I'll just rattle off a few of them. Climate change, that's going to be a big foreign policy issue. Russia, and even before Russia, China. My guess is Iran, and kind of where that relationship fits in. It's going to have to be rebuilding of relations with allies in Europe, particularly in NATO. All of this takes time and energy. Individual policymakers, however smart they are, they only have 24 hours in a day, and they can't do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's just not going to be there. So, we talk about bandwidth. How much of that time can you devote to the problems that the new president has identified or that are going to emerge, whether he identifies them or not. That's a long way of saying I wouldn't expect high-level engagement on the South Caucasus, on this conflict, under the current situation. I think there'll be new people coming in who will have at levels below those that I just spoke about, who will have the responsibility for day-to-day involvement of the U.S. in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. So at a minimum, I think there will be more attention at that level given to this. What form it will take, I don't know. That's just beyond me. But I wouldn't expect that this would be the #1 agenda item on senior policymakers' priority list when they come into their new positions on the 21st of January. So I would be hopeful, let me put it that way, that there'll be more attention to this region and to the conflict, specifically to keep the war from breaking out again. I worry if we don't get this system of engagement underway, that when the weather becomes better in the spring, that the incentives for going back to war may increase, and we have to keep that from happening. get Yerevan and Baku focused on a process for building peace. That's the, that's the thing. And so I would hope that that the new team will be able to at least provide that kind of engagement. And we'll just have to see what what evolves. But I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but the authorities in Baku and Yerevan own this. It's up to them, quite frankly. They can do this. They can, really. They don't need Russia or the US if that's the political decision. And it's a hard one because when you sit down, in a negotiating session with the other party to the conflict, if ugly words like compromise and reaching an agreement that may not be in the total interest of either side, but necessary in order to make progress, those become the hard choices. I don't think the Minsk group is going to go away either, but that's just an observation. Call it something else if you want to be creative, but there has to be a framework of an outside organization, and I think the OSCE is probably the best. I think it's better than the UN for a lot of reasons, and I think Russia needs to be part of the process. I think Europe has to be, the US has to be. I'm not quite sure how you work Turkey into that, but Turkey's going to be a factor. So that's where I hope the progress can be made with the new administration. It's not going to be, a flashy, President Biden coming to Baku and Yerevan, though that's not a bad idea either. But I just don't think it's going to be that kind of thing. I think it's going to be more, more keeping war from breaking out and more trying to put a framework in place for Armenia and Azerbaijan to talk.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your valuable thoughts. It was a pleasure to converse with you.
Well, it's my advice is free. That's the advantage of being in the academic world and not having the responsibility of decision makers in government anywhere. But on the other hand, it does give me an opportunity to do whatever I can to keep what was a tragic war with immense human losses, material losses as well, from starting again. So that's all I can do right now. But thank you for the interest. I hope more people in the region can begin to talk about these kinds of questions and really start to build for a much better future. You and your people deserve it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kauzlarich.
Okay.